Very, very warm welcome to all those who have joined the opening of this MenEngage Ubuntu Symposium from all around the world. Ms. Regnér, this is the year of Beijing Plus 25 commemoration for, something which everyone holds with a lot of significance, particularly if you are a women's rights activist. You have been leading the global UN Agency for Women's Rights, and this is also the 10th anniversary of UN Women. And you have been one of the advocates on the importance of engaging men and boys for gender equality. So what is your assessment of where we need to be and what we need to do today at this critical time for gender equality, with men and boys as activists, advocates, and allies for gender equality? And what does a gender equal post-COVID world look like? And what is the role that leaders need to be playing to get us there?
We did take stock of what happened after the Beijing conference 25 years ago, since that is still the only action plan we have globally for gender equality. Unless we all come together and work on gender equality, we will not reach results, and we haven't. There is too much power in the hands of men in all measurable ways, almost. The area where we have had a success is actually education, which is a very important one, where girls nowadays attend school almost to the same extent as boys, at least pre-COVID. We also know that levels of violence against women, we have not been able to lower those levels, and during COVID they also spiked. We from UN Women, we think obviously that he for she is a good initiative, since we took the initiative to introduce it, but we have to fill that now with evidence-based, knowledge-based work. We mean by that men can support women in leadership roles. Men need to see their own privilege that they have as men. We all need to facilitate for men to be fathers actively. We know that has a great impact on gender norms.
As the president of Ford Foundation, what is your greatest concern about the current state of our world? How do men, masculinities, power, and accountability contribute to the problem and in also finding a solution?
Let me begin by saying the thing that concerns me greatly in the world is the context in which this discussion is occurring. It is a context of growing authoritarianism. It is a context of recognition of the legacy of white supremacy, of colonialism that has contributed to the environment that has enabled so much of the toxic patriarchy that is at the center of the challenge before us. We must continue to push ourselves, to ask ourselves, why aren't we making more progress? I believe part of the reason we aren't making more progress is because of this power dynamic that remains, that seemingly is propagated, is instantiated into our systems. And this is why we must address and dismantle those systems. And we will do that both through attacking and addressing culture, but also in addressing it through policy. If we believe in justice, we must put women and girls in the global South. It is our job to support them in elevating their voice, to resource them to be heard by influencers, by the powerful, by policymakers. And when we do this, I firmly believe we will see the kind of transformation that this planet so desperately needs.
MenEngage Alliance has in its mission statement that the work on engaging men and transforming masculinities need to be informed by intersectional feminist approaches. For someone like you and your organization, who are at the forefront on working with feminist approaches, what is a feminist approach to engaging with men and boys? What are the challenges? What needs to be done better? And what are the opportunities?
We all know that at this time, the idea of gender has changed. It's gone through a profound transformation. The neat binaries of men, women, within which the world and its people could be organized, and civil society, social justice actors, governments could use to design programs and policies have increasingly been called into question. And these have resulted in striking at the roots of patriarchal and heteronormative power structures and resulted in a backlash that can be categorized as anti-gender politics. The anti-gender politics stems from fostering a deep sense of fear and vulnerability built around the crisis of masculinity. And one byproduct of this is the ideas of the strong male leader, accompanied by a hyper-nationalist discourse that is anti-immigration and in general detrimental to women's human rights. So I want to speak about our work around gender-based violence. A lot of us use this terminology interchangeably: violence against women versus gender-based violence. A gender-based violence approach also includes, issues of, looking at violence against effeminate boys, violence against people that transgress any kind of norms in society that have to do with sexuality, gender, and rights. I think one of the key questions for all of us today is how do we positively engage men without making them feel either alienated, angry, guilty, or paralyzed? Of course, I'm speaking about the men who want to be partners, who want to contribute. We recognize that men and boys are typically traditional power bearers and beneficiaries of patriarchal social norms, but they are essential actors in reshaping these power structures and achieving a more just world. But we can't design solutions based on the assumption that all men are equal or experience masculinities in the same way.
You are just in your prime youth, Lucas, but you have already been active for gender equality and social justice in so many ways. Can you share with us about the issues you are most passionate about, and how do you analyze the global context from a gender perspective on masculinities?
It is extremely necessary that we have an education with a strong gender perspective. In Argentina, we have had the comprehensive sexual education law for more than 10 years, and it has not been implemented effectively yet. Institutional responses to all these issues are necessary, really necessary. Argentine sociologist and feminist referent Victoria Freire says that generations are built when they manage to push the limit of what is possible. I think that is what we just do today, push the limit of what is possible with the issue of masculinities as well as with many others. But what happens when we try to push that limit of what is possible? What happens when we propose great transformations? It is clear throughout the world the strong emergence of hate speech, reactionary speech, where the forms of hegemonic masculinity, violence of all kinds are clearly observed. Here, I think it's important to note that these issues are often reflected in politics, in those reactionary speeches, but in our actions in the world of politics as well as everywhere, but political violence is often made invisible. In front of this, I think that once again, rethinking the collective and taking charge of that is fundamental. Build collective spaces that are not of male complicity, but that break with that and are spaces for cohabitation. It's important that these cohabitations go through us as regular thoughts, and also thinking about the importance of transversality. Thinking about politics and the construction of large social movements, I believe that this transversality is fundamental from an intersectional perspective. This great tool that feminism brings is important when thinking about masculinities too. I think that for us, men, implies taking over the task of rethinking ourselves collectively. And although we often wonder what place we can occupy in the feminist movement, I think we have to reverse the question and ask ourselves what place feminism occupies in us men and in each of our lives.
Nyasha, what are you hearing from the young women and girls in the communities with regards to the work on engaging men and boys? What does accountability mean and look like to you when centering feminist principles?
There's quite a lot of misconceptions around what is gender equality, what is gender equity. And some of those misconceptions were deeply rooted in how our societies view gender as a social norm, or how our societies define gender as a social norm. And for us to be able to really dismantle this kind of misconcepts around gender and gender equality, it has been very useful to be able to engage with men and boys and be able to sit together on the same table and have a robust discussion or conversation which is free and frank, to discuss on the dynamics that currently exist between men and women and how we can work together to bridge such gaps and challenges. So for me, the role that men and boys can play is to be accountable, that for now, they sort of are the custodians of resources, and what should they do to ensure that there is equitable access for everybody in order to engage and to promote and advance issues of gender equality. And then one other thing that also helps when we talk about accountability, I think it's also very important to take accountability from just a mere discussion, but how do we practically implement accountability? What strategies or what tools do we have in place that can enable organizations working around gender equality to be able to hold themselves accountable internally, to be able to hold processes to account, to be able to hold engagements or platforms that people can speak around gender equality to account. So I think basically from our end, it has been quite a learning phase, a learning engagement to see the new event of how we can engage together with men and boys in our discussion. And it has been something that has promoted the leadership of adolescent girls and young women. However, they still need to work on a lot of how this partnership or dynamic works, so that we don't continue again having that overbearing patriarchal nature that usually happens whenever you have men and boys. And another thing that we need to also look at is whenever we're having this kind of conversation, it's beautiful to see all the men who might be around here sitting in this forum listening to us talking about gender equality and everything. But I always say that charity begins at home. So it's also very important that when we start to practice to talk about gender equality and accountability, it's not all about the work that we do, which gets us paid. It's not about the advocacy work that we are doing, that we speak on forums or we speak people to know us, but it's also about in our families, where we're coming from. Are we practicing that? In our communities, are we also practicing that? And in every space that we engage, are we also practicing that?
As an international leader, you've been able to bring so much of the issues of indigenous population from a gender just angle at the global level. So given the theme of this symposium, what can we learn from indigenous communities and cultures on the issues of humanity and equality?
Es complejo cuando se viene de una cultura totalmente occidental y luego nos encontramos con escenarios de culturas originarias o culturas indígenas o nativas que tienen sus propias filosofías, sus propias formas de actuar. Entonces, también hace falta que podamos trazar esa línea horizontal en el diálogo y en el análisis de las interseccionalidades, pero también en las diversidades, tanto culturales como de formas de pensamiento.
As an intersectional activist and leader, what are your major learnings that the field of engaging men and boys or gender equality broadly needs to do, given the current context in the US and globally?
It is not possible to dismantle unequal power dynamics without recognizing that a person must be willing to relinquish their own power to do so. Again, this is hard to do with people who are opposed to our movements, but to be honest, it is also difficult within our own movements. We can hold multiple truths at once, and another truth is that intra-community and within our movement, we yield more power, unearned power, over Black women, and that must be addressed and dismantled. And that's for a number of reasons. That's for history, that's due to religion, that's due to people not really agreeing or understanding feminism and gender equity, that's due to homophobia and transphobia. But it's very clear that if we do deep dives in the movement and intra-community, that there are power dynamics, right? You know, again, I always describe as a Black queer man, I both hold power, and I both can be oppressed, right? Because that's how we actually acknowledge systematic harm. And so it's important to talk about what intersectionality is and what it's not. So intersectionality, as defined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black woman who defined the term, is a metaphor for understanding the ways multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage compound themselves. So how does race compound with gender? How does gender compound with sexuality? How does sexuality compound with disability? How does disability compound with economic status, among other things? It is not simply counting identities. And in the United States, many mainstream white feminists often incorrectly use intersectionality to count identities. And that is not what intersectionality is. It is a way to look at our identities and see how they're compounded and how they're overlapping with one another, particularly in a society that is rooted in capitalism, anti-Blackness, ableism, among other things. Intersectionality teaches us that we must work from the bottom up. And in order to do that work, we must center the most marginalized communities. Because when you center the most marginalized communities, what you actually do is ensure that people who naturally have resources and power and other allocations or distribution of resources, they're naturally going to be okay. It is the people who have experienced the greatest harm that we actually must center and encourage policies, narrative change, and culture shift in a way that actually helps them not only survive, but thrive.
Lina, as a feminist activist, leader, and academic from the Arab region, what trends do you see in the advancement of gender equality and women's rights in the region and globally that you consider important for us to have in mind throughout the symposium dialogues and strategizing for ways forward?
What is working, actually specific to the region, and I think also around the world, is that young people, especially young women, are really galvanized. They are motivated, they are inspired. I'm seeing with every generation, they become stronger, more articulate in their demands, less willing to compromise, more clear in what equality means, how they want to achieve it. So I think it's really time for us to expand our ways of thinking and look at what is happening with the next generation, what is happening with the real grassroots indigenous movements, and how we are going to let them take over and actually finish the work that we haven't finished. Because everybody comes out to march for each other, these goals are all interconnected. So the LGBTQ movement in the region, environment, ending violence, addressing government corruption and other issues. I think people feel like these are interconnected, and they are, and it's about time we see them that way.
What challenges do you see regarding gender equality and male engagement?
We have this ICPD program of action from 25 years ago as the basis. It's a very good document, really underlining that this is about the rights of the individual woman, young girl, and child. But how do we communicate that, basic thing to young people today? What does it mean to them? What does it mean to a young girl? This document from 25 years ago with a lot of long text and so on. I think we need to be better in actually showing this is what it's actually all about. This is about being able to finish your school even though you get pregnant. It's about actually having knowledge about how you avoid to getting pregnant and having access to means to avoid that. And it's also about, boys knowing that as well. Accountability is key. We need to, of course, engage men, and men wants to be part of the solution. That's also part of the power. This is always a question of, going into addressing social norms, cultural norms, power norms, and it's about always if you need to give into something, you consider it that you give away power.